Why won't this master key open your car? This is a violation." That was the first thing I heard at 7:12 a.m. on what should have been a peaceful morning. I stepped onto my porch, coffee still steaming in my hand, only to find HOA Karen hunched over the driver's side door of my truck, jamming a shiny brass master key into the lock like she was defusing a bomb. She spun toward me with theatrical outrage. "All vehicles in this neighborhood must allow HOA emergency access. Your refusal is highly suspicious," she declared. I hadn't said a single word. When her magical key failed again, she gasped dramatically, whipped out her phone, and dialed 911 right in front of me. "Hello? Yes, there's a non-compliant male preventing a mandatory HOA safety inspection on his vehicle." She pointed at me like I was a car thief. What she didn't know, the non-compliant male she was reporting was the county sheriff. Before we get into this unbelievable story, comment your city and local time below, and don't forget to subscribe for more HOA chaos. I had dealt with unreasonable people before, comes with the badge, but nothing prepared me for the level of creative nonsense Karen managed to weaponize on a daily basis. And the funny thing is, before she tried to unlock my truck with a so-called master key, I genuinely believed she was just another overly enthusiastic HOA president with too much time and too many clipboards. I'd been wrong before, but never this spectacularly. To understand how we got to the moment she called 911 on the county sheriff without realizing it, I need to take you back a few years, back to the day I first moved into this quiet little cul-de-sac at the edge of the HOA's jurisdiction. My house sat on the border of their governance, close enough that Karen could see it, but far enough that she technically had no authority over any square inch of my property. And that technicality was the single greatest frustration of her entire personality. The very first time she introduced herself, she didn't say hello or welcome to the neighborhood. She marched up my driveway with a clipboard tucked under her arm like a prosecutor getting ready for trial. "Law enforcement vehicles may cause unnecessary alarm," she said, nodding toward my patrol cruiser. "I'll need you to park that elsewhere." It took me a moment to process the absurdity of the request. I explained politely that the cruiser was legally registered, legally parked, and legally immune to her personal discomfort. She forced a smile that didn't reach her eyes, made a note on her clipboard, and walked off like she was filing paperwork for my eventual eviction. And that was just the warm-up act. A few days later, I found a piece of paper taped to my cruiser windshield. In bold letters, it read, "Unauthorized government imagery visible from public view, $45. Fine." Government imagery? She meant the sheriff's badge on the door. I actually laughed out loud, peeled the paper off the windshield, and tucked it into a binder. At that time, I didn't know just how thick that binder would eventually become, or how many categories of nonsense I'd have to create for the avalanche of future offenses. Over the next year, I received an unbelievable range of HOA citations that weren't actually citations at all, just pieces of paper she'd printed at home. Once, she tried to fine me for leaving tire tracks in the driveway after a rainstorm. She called them unauthorized terrain modification. Another time, she accused me of visual intimidation because she didn't like how the sun reflected off my truck's chrome grille. But the moment that really set her off, the moment she transformed from nuisance to self-proclaimed regulator of my existence, was when she asked me to provide the HOA with a copy of my car keys for emergency purposes. I looked her dead in the eye and said, "Absolutely not." She blinked, stunned that anyone would deny her. Then she cleared her throat, lifted her chin, and replied, "We'll revisit this." And I should have known that meant trouble. Fast forward to the morning she jammed her brass master key into my truck door and called 911. After Deputy Ray revealed who I was and she had finished buffering like a frozen computer screen, she eventually stormed off in humiliation. But humiliation, for Karen, wasn't a deterrent, it was fuel. By the next morning, the first signs of escalation appeared: bright pink flyers taped to every mailbox, every lamppost, every trash bin. They were impossible to miss, partly because of the glitter glue and partly because of the hysterical all-caps title, "Urgent Community Action Required, Stop the Non-Compliant Vehicle." She even added tiny stars around the heading, as if decorating a bake sale poster. The flyer accused my truck of being a community risk, claimed I refused to participate in HOA-approved vehicle safety protocols, and insisted residents must vote to require all neighborhood vehicles to provide universal HOA access credentials. In other words, she wanted a key to everyone's car. My neighbor Mark knocked on my door that afternoon, holding one of the flyers. "Is this about you?" he asked, rubbing his temples. "Apparently," I said. He groaned. "She fined me last week because my car was too red. Said it was visually aggressive. I wasn't surprised." Karen's interpretation of HOA rules had never been grounded in anything resembling reality, but this new crusade was on another level entirely. Later that evening, I found a bright yellow notice tucked under my windshield wiper. Notice of parking violation, excessive vehicle presence, $65. Fine. Excessive presence. In my own driveway, I added that to the binder. The following day, she held what she called an HOA emergency meeting. Someone recorded it and sent it to me, possibly as entertainment, possibly as evidence. Watching it felt like watching a parody of a political rally hosted by someone who had read half a textbook on leadership and decided she was ready for world domination. Her presentation included a pie chart showing my truck as the #1 cause of community instability, a blurry photo of my vehicle taken from a suspiciously low angle, a slide titled Potential Threat Indicators, which listed size, color, reflectiveness, authority symbolism, and owner non-compliance. She concluded her speech by declaring that the HOA must take immediate action to restore driveway harmony. One resident raised a timid hand and said, "Isn't that the sheriff's truck?" Karen snapped back. Authority does not exempt anyone from community standards. To be honest, hearing her say that made me laugh. I couldn't make this stuff up if I tried. But the laughter didn't last long. By the next morning, 3 new notices appeared on my truck: reflective paint disturbance, unauthorized law enforcement symbols, driveway shadow imbalance, driveway shadow imbalance. She was now fining me for the shape of my truck's shadow. That was when I realized this wasn't just another HOA spat. Karen was escalating towards something much bigger, much louder, and far more absurd than anything I'd seen up to that point. She wasn't simply annoyed by my truck, she was obsessed with controlling it, controlling me, controlling everything she believed fell under the spirit of the HOA. And the real kicker, my driveway wasn't under the HOA at all. I knew I needed to start documenting everything meticulously. Not as a neighbor, as a sheriff. I began gathering photos of every flyer and notice, screenshots of her emails, recordings of her meetings, statements from neighbors who also felt targeted, copies of the so-called master key guidelines she claimed to enforce. I wasn't building a case out of spite. I was doing it because I could see exactly where Karen was heading, toward a legal collision, and just when I thought she couldn't possibly get any more irrational, she proved me wrong the next morning. I stepped outside and saw 26 small neon orange flags lining my driveway in 2 perfectly straight rows, like a weird ceremonial runway leading to my truck. Each flag carried the same message: HOA claim, pending vehicle access, gate under review. A gate. She was planning to build a gate across my driveway to control vehicle access. The footprints around the flags were hers. I recognized the pattern. Those orthopedic sandals never lied. I crouched down, looked at her handiwork, and realized something important. Karen wasn't just reacting anymore. She was planning. She had declared war, and she had absolutely no idea she had just crossed the worst possible line. The legal one. I stood there staring at the neat little rows of neon orange flags, each one stuck into the soil with almost obsessive precision. The early morning sun lit them up like runway lights, guiding an airplane onto a landing strip, except instead of a plane, they guided anyone's eyes straight to my truck. It was dramatic, ridiculous, and undeniably Karen. I bent down, plucked one of the flags from the ground, and read it again just to make sure I wasn't hallucinating. HOA claim pending vehicle access, gate under review, a gate across my driveway. To regulate access to my own vehicle, I took a long, slow breath, letting the absurdity settle in. Karen didn't just dip a toe across the line this time. She sprinted past it and kept running like she was training for the HOA Olympics. Her latest stunt didn't just feel invasive, it felt strategic, planned. She had probably spent half the night lining up these flags, muttering rule numbers that didn't exist, believing she was laying the foundation for a new era of community control. I wasn't angry. I wasn't even annoyed. I was fascinated, because when someone starts behaving this bizarrely, you get that instinct. The same one that kicks in while questioning a suspect who's about to incriminate themselves without realizing it. Karen wasn't sabotaging me. She was building my case for me. Still holding the flag, I pulled out my phone and photographed every angle: footprints, spacing, the position of the flags relative to the driveway. It would come in handy later when the real authorities, the ones who actually had jurisdiction, looked into this. Right on cue, my phone buzzed with a text message. It was from Mark, the neighbor who'd complained about Karen finding him for having a red car. "Dude, check your driveway. She's lost her mind." I replied with the photo of the flags. His response came back instantly. "Oh my God, she's making runways now." I actually laughed. But the morning comedy show wasn't over yet. A few minutes later, I heard the familiar clack, clack, clack of Karen's sandals marching down the street. I didn't have to turn around to know it was her. Her footsteps were as recognizable as her voice. She appeared at the bottom of my driveway, clipboard hugged against her chest like a holy artifact. "Good morning," she said, voice tight with fake politeness. "I'm sure it is," I replied, still holding her neon orange flag like evidence. She adjusted her sunglasses. "I see you've discovered the preliminary markers. The HOA has initiated a vehicle access evaluation for community safety. On my property lines," she said, waving a dismissive hand, "are fluid when it comes to safety concerns." I raised an eyebrow. "Fluid?" "Yes, and as acting HOA president, I have full authority to take precautionary measures when a resident refuses compliance." She nodded toward my truck. "And your vehicle's defiance is well documented." I almost choked on my own air. My truck's defiance. "It refused universal access," she said, as if that sentence made sense in the English language. I let the silence sit for a moment, mostly because I couldn't decide which part to address first. Eventually I gestured at the flags. "You put these here yourself." "Of course I did," she said proudly. The board was unanimous. My eyes narrowed. That was a lie. Or at least, a major exaggeration. I knew the board was tired of Karen's antics. They'd whispered complaints, exchanged knowing glances, even apologized to me behind her back. "Is that so?" I asked. "Unanimous?" "Well," she shifted slightly. "Unanimous in spirit." "Ah, spirit. The best friend of anyone who didn't actually have votes." I took a step toward her, polite but firm. "Karen, this is private property. You're trespassing. And these flags, this gate you're planning, have no legal standing." Her chin snapped upward. "Not yet." That made me pause. "Not yet." Karen clutched her clipboard like a shield. "I'll be drafting an amendment for the next HOA meeting. The community will vote to place all vehicles within visual proximity of HOA land under shared authority. It's progressive. It's illegal," I countered. She brushed off the comment with a scoff. "Laws adapt, communities evolve." Then she added, almost giddily, "Besides, residents deserve protection from rogue vehicles." My truck was now a rogue vehicle. Marvelous. I took another photo of her standing proudly among the flags. Karen noticed and stiffened. "What are you doing?" "Documenting," I said simply. She frowned, recognizing that word as one that could be used against her later. "You can't intimidate me," she snapped, though her voice wavered. "I will not be threatened by someone who thinks he's above community standards." I smiled. "Karen, I think you're forgetting something." "And what is that?" "You called 911 on the sheriff." Her face flushed pink anger or embarrassment. I couldn't tell. Maybe both. "That was a misunderstanding," she said quickly. "You told dispatch I was refusing an HOA inspection." "I stand by that." "You told them I was suspicious." "You were suspicious." I was holding a cup of coffee. Her lips pressed into a thin line. It was clear she didn't enjoy the memory of her humiliation being brought up. Without another word, she spun on her heel and stormed off, leaving me with a driveway full of flags and the distinct suspicion that this was far from over. And I was right. Because that afternoon, while I was returning from town, I saw a tow truck parked suspiciously close to my driveway. The driver stood next to it, scratching his head, looking at a paper in his hand like it was written in ancient code. I pulled up and stepped out of my vehicle. "Hey there," I said. "Everything all right?" He looked at me, then down at the paper, then back at me. Ma'am, from the HOA, told me this truck was abandoned and needed removal." I exhaled slowly. "Abandoned." She said it hadn't moved in weeks. "I drove it yesterday." He blinked. "She also said the owner was refusing to comply with safety checks." I pointed to the sheriff's emblem on the door. I'm the owner. The man's face drained of color. Oh man, she didn't mention that. I'm sure she didn't. He folded the paper and shoved it in his pocket like it was cursed. Sorry, sir, I'm leaving. Right now. He climbed back into the tow truck and took off like he was fleeing a crime scene. I looked at my driveway, the flags, the disappearing tow truck, and the growing ridiculousness of the entire situation. This wasn't just pettiness anymore. It was escalation. Deliberate escalation. Karen wasn't just trying to control my vehicle. She was trying to create a narrative in which I was the problem, the danger, the threat, and if there's anything I know after 2 decades on the force, it's that when someone builds a false narrative, they eventually back themselves into a corner. Later that evening, as the sky turned orange and purple, I walked back outside and removed every single neon flag, one by one, a quiet, methodical undoing of Karen's imaginary empire. I gathered them into a pile, photographed the empty ground for good measure, and stored the flags in a box labeled Evidence Vehicle Incidents. Because the truth was clear, Karen wasn't finished. The master key was just her opening move. The flags were her attempt at expansion, and I could feel it in my bones. She was preparing for something even bigger, something with clipboards, something with signatures, something she believed would finally give her the power she had invented in her head, and I was prepared too. I was ready to meet her escalation with documentation, patience, and when the moment came, the full weight of actual law. Because in this neighborhood, there was only room for one sheriff. And, spoiler alert, it wasn't Karen. I woke up the next morning, expecting peace. After the tow truck fiasco, I naively thought Karen might take a day off from her imaginary war. Maybe she'd cool down, bake cookies, yell at a cloud, anything other than targeting my truck again. But the universe had other plans. When I stepped outside, coffee in hand, I froze. My truck, my perfectly fine, minding its own business, truck was shackled. A giant yellow wheel clamp was locked onto the front tire like some kind of medieval punishment device for naughty vehicles. For a split second, all I could do was blink. The bold stenciled letters on the boot read, HOA impound non-compliant vehicle. There wasn't enough caffeine in the world for this. I set my mug on the hood and crouched down to inspect the clamp. It was real metal, real heavy, and very much real property damage if she'd scratched my rim. A laminated tag dangled from the lock. Release fee, $350, plus processing fee, $25, plus administrative fee, $15, total due, $390. Karen really woke up and chose grand larceny today. Behind me, I heard the unmistakable shuffle of triumphant sandals. I didn't turn. I already knew who it was. Well, she called, arms crossed. Perhaps now you'll learn to respect community authority. I stood slowly. You put a wheel clamp on my truck? It's not your truck, she snapped. It's a community-adjacent vehicle subject to oversight. Impoundment was necessary after repeated violations. I exhaled through my nose, the way I do right before reading someone their Miranda rights. Karen, this is illegal. No, she corrected, tapping her clipboard. This is proactive neighborhood safety enforcement. You immobilized a law enforcement vehicle. Her eyes narrowed. A vehicle used to intimidate residents. Frankly, you should thank me. For committing a crime, for holding you accountable. I laughed, not because any of this was funny, but because I had 2 options. Lose my mind or enjoy the show. And at this point, the show had gone off the rails. Karen, I said, remove the clamp. She recoiled. Absolutely not. You will pay the release fee, just like everyone else. No one else has ever had a boot on their car. Because no one else has ever been this non-compliant, her voice cracked at the end, like she was seconds away from throwing herself dramatically onto the ground and demanding a Netflix documentary about her struggles. Karen, I tried again, you cannot impound someone's vehicle, especially not off HOA property, she smirked. We'll see what the board says. I stared blankly. The board? Yes, she said proudly. They authorized this? They did? Yes, she insisted. At that moment, my neighbor Jill peeked out from behind her curtain and made eye contact with me. She shook her head violently. No, absolutely not. The board did not approve this. Caught in her lie? Karen pivoted instantly. Well, they didn't oppose it. That's not the same thing. It is in spirit, she declared. Ah, yes, the HOA spirit where reality went to die. I pulled out my phone. Karen stiffened but tried to hold her ground. I snapped photos of the clamp, her, the driveway, everything. She scoffed. Oh, please, you think pictures will scare me? No, I said calmly, but they will help the police. Her lips parted in horror. Police? You wouldn't dare. Oh, I dare. I dialed dispatch, not 911, just non-emergency, and requested a deputy respond for unlawful immobilization of a vehicle. Since I was off duty and involved personally, I couldn't handle it myself. Policy is policy, Karen panicked. You're weaponizing law enforcement. This is harassment. I pointed to the clamp. You immobilized a government asset. Before she could argue, a familiar patrol cruiser rolled into view. Deputy Hernandez stepped out, took one look at the clamp, then turned to me with an expression that said not again. Morning, Sheriff, he said under his breath. Karen, I confirmed. Karen threw her hands up. Finally, someone reasonable, officer, arrest him for refusing to follow HOA impoundment protocol. Hernandez stared at her for a long moment. Ma'am, there is no HOA impoundment protocol. There should be, she shouted. That's not how laws work, he replied. She jabbed her pen toward the clamp. This vehicle is out of compliance. I tried the master key. Stop, I said, raising a finger. Do not confess to more crimes. Hernandez sighed and pulled out his pad. Ma'am, did you place this device on the sheriff's truck? I issued a lawful community corrective action. Did you buy this online? Yes, she said proudly. It's heavy duty, and comes in different colors. Ma'am, he interrupted, you cannot immobilize property you don't own. This is tampering and potentially vehicle interference. She gasped. Vehicle interference, how dare you imply? He's not implying, I said. He's reading the law. This is oppression, she shrieked, of the HOA. If hysterical righteousness were a fuel source, Karen could have powered the entire county. Hernandez wrote out an official warning and instructed her to remove the clamp immediately. She refused. He repeated the instruction. She refused again. Finally, he said, if you don't remove it, we will. The glare she gave him could have peeled paint, but she stomped over, fiddled angrily with the lock, and yanked the clamp off the tire like she was ripping betrayal from her soul. She dragged it away, muttering about tyranny and rogue vehicles. She left without another word. But her retreat didn't last long. 2 days later, she came back with reinforcements. Not people, just paperwork, stacks of it. Glossy brochures she made at home titled, The Great Vehicle Harmony Initiative. She taped them to every door in the neighborhood. Some bullet points included, mandatory HOA access keys for all cars, HOA-controlled parking rotation schedules, monthly driveway compliance inspections, fines for visually disruptive automobile silhouettes. I laughed so hard I had to sit down. But Karen wasn't laughing. She was doubling down. That week, I received 13 separate violations: parking too confidently, vehicle presence exceeding comfort threshold, potential intimidation due to height, license plate, numerically aggressive, unauthorized reflective surfaces, excessive durability, owner attitude non-compliant, truck windows too transparent, driving patterns unpredictable, tire grooves emotionally sharp, paint color too authoritative, shadow cast exceeds 4-5 feet, sheriff emblem improper for suburban setting. Each one was more absurd than the last. I documented everything. I made a second binder, then a third, and after seeing me gather evidence, Karen realized something. She wasn't intimidating me. So, she changed tactics. The next escalation came on a quiet Wednesday morning. I returned from the grocery store to find a plywood barricade erected across the entrance of my driveway. It was spray-painted with, HO parking zone authorized vehicles only. Zip ties held it together. A laminated sign hung from the center, violators will be fined. I stepped out of my truck, stared at the barricade, and muttered, she has lost her mind. Then I walked over, lifted the entire structure with one hand. It weighed maybe 8 pounds and set it neatly beside a tree with a sticky note. Nice decor, wrong house. The next day, a city inspector knocked on my door. Got a call from someone claiming there's a dangerous illegal parking structure on this property. Of course, she called the city on herself by accident. I showed him the makeshift gate. He snorted. Yeah, no, this is not up to code, or reality. He took photos, made notes, and left laughing. Karen watched from across the street, arms folded, seething like a kettle left on high heat. She didn't speak that day, but her silence was worse. Calculated, focused. I'd seen that look before on people determined to dig their own grave and blame the shovel. I knew then that the wheel clamp and barricade were just beginning. She was planning something bigger, something more dramatic, something she thought would finally force me to submit to HOA authority. And she had no idea she was walking straight into a legal disaster. For once, I didn't have to lift a finger. She was going to take care of that all on her own. The strange quiet that settled over the neighborhood after the barricade incident wasn't comforting. It wasn't peaceful. It felt like the air right before a tornado touches down, too still, too heavy, too unnatural. Karen had disappeared for almost 48 hours. And, for someone who thrived on daily micromanagement, that silence was not a sign of surrender. It was a sign she was assembling her next disaster. And it arrived on the morning of the third day. I opened my mailbox, expecting bills, junk coupons, maybe another brochure about lawn fertilizer. Instead, a thick, glossy packet slid out with a thud. The cover featured a dramatic photo of a winding suburban street with animated sparkles around parked cars, like some kind of magical parking utopia. Across the top, in bold lettering, the Community Vehicle Harmony Initiative, presented by Bluff Neighborhood Mobility Council. A council? We didn't have a council. I leaned against the mailbox and flipped it open. The first page had a letter from the desk of Acting Coordinator Kay Allen. Karen had rebranded herself. Whenever she reinvented her title, the situation was never good. The letter claimed that, due to recent vehicular disturbances caused by resistance to universal access measures, the neighborhood would implement a new set of mandatory regulations. Mandatory. She loved that word. The next pages outlined a ridiculous list of rules, each more illegal than the last. All vehicles must be registered with the Mobility Council. Owners must provide an emergency access key upon request. Driveways may be inspected without notice for compliance. Parking zones may be reassigned at any time for harmony redistribution. Unauthorized vehicle silhouette patterns will incur penalties. Vehicle silhouette patterns, a real human being typed that. At the back of the packet was a payment page, the part she cared about most. Mobility Harmony, contribution fee, $89, due within 5 days. She included a QR code linking to a PayPal account named Bluff Vehicle Safety Fund. I laughed. Out loud. Right there at my mailbox. At 7:30 in the morning. Like a man who had reached the point where the only sane reaction to insanity was amusement. But when I looked up, I stopped laughing, because there she was, standing across the street by her Prius, dressed in a navy blazer and tan slacks, wearing a fake earpiece that was very clearly not connected to anything. She watched me read her packet with the expression of someone waiting for praise they absolutely didn't deserve. I held up the booklet. A new council, she nodded proudly. Formed due to community demand. What community? I asked. Residents have expressed overwhelming concern. Name one, she blinked. Concerns may remain anonymous. For safety. Safety from what? My truck's shadow. She refused to engage with the sarcasm. Instead, she stepped closer, lowering her voice as if sharing a state secret. Your vehicle has become a symbol of disorder, she said. People are frightened. A strong neighborhood cannot function when residents feel threatened by unpredictable silhouettes. My truck had now become a symbol, a silhouette-based threat. Incredible. I flipped the packet closed. Karen, this is fraud. She stiffened. This is community leadership. What you're doing is illegal. What I'm doing, she said, jabbing her clipboard toward the sky, is necessary. For who? For everyone. The delusion radiated off her like heat. Karen, I said calmly, you cannot create fake councils to collect fees. You cannot demand keys to people's vehicles. You cannot find shadows. She smiled, a tight and brittle thing. We'll see what the legal advisory panel thinks. Who's on the panel? I asked. She hesitated. Me. I almost choked. So you created a council, appointed yourself coordinator, and then created a legal panel, which is also you. She crossed her arms. Someone has to take responsibility, and that someone is always you. Exactly. I rubbed my forehead. Karen, do you hear how strange that sounds? I hear how necessary it sounds. This woman needed not an HOA, but a hobby. Before I could respond, she thrust a clipboard toward me. Sign the compliance acknowledgement. I didn't touch it. No, very well. She scribbled something onto her pad. Refusal to acknowledge notice. Additional fee. $13. Not 10, not 15. $13. Why 13? Because Karen operated on chaos math. She walked off, smug as a cat who thought she'd caught a mouse. Except I wasn't the mouse, I was the sheriff, and she was stapling nonsense to her own downfall. Inside my house, I spread everything out on the table, the packet, the fines, the barricade photos, the wheel clamp, screenshots from neighbors who'd texted me their own violations. There was enough evidence to wallpaper a courtroom. I called the sheriff's office not as the sheriff, but as a citizen filing a complaint. Since I was directly involved, protocol required that another deputy handle the case. Hernandez, reliable as ever, took the report. Bluff, Neighborhood Mobility Council, he muttered. Never heard of it. It didn't exist until today, I said. He whistled. She really doesn't know when to stop. No, I agreed. She really doesn't. All right, he said. Send me everything. This might cross the line into attempted fraud. I emailed him the documents, photos, timestamps, and links. He thanked me and said he'd begin verifying Karen's claims, or rather, disproving them. That evening, as I sat on my porch reading through her booklet again, trying to decide whether silhouette patterns should become a running joke at the station, my neighbor Jill approached hesitantly. She looked around, making sure Karen wasn't nearby. Can we talk? She whispered. Of course. She stepped closer. We need your help. The HOA board, we're done. We can't deal with her anymore. I raised an eyebrow. What happened now? She told the board we needed to create a parking brigade. She wants weekly driveway inspections, and she tried to fine one of the board members because her SUV felt rebellious. I rubbed my eyes. I wish I could say I'm surprised. She's out of control, Jill said. We've had enough. We want to vote her out, but we need solid evidence, provable stuff, things she can't wiggle out of later. I gestured toward the dining table inside, stacked with paperwork like a crime lab display. I've got evidence. Jill's eyes widened. How much? Binders, plural, 3 so far. She let out a breath like someone who had just seen daylight for the first time in months. This could work, but you have to be there. The board meeting is Friday. I'll be there. She hesitated, then asked, one more thing. Is it true she called 911 on you? Yes, and didn't know you were. The sheriff. Correct. Jill covered her face and groaned. Oh God, this is worse than I thought. I nodded. Yes it is. She left with a promise. The board would prepare the motion to remove Karen, but Karen wasn't going to sit quietly. Oh no. She had sensed resistance. She had smelled rebellion, and like any dictator whose regime was cracking, she ramped up her efforts. The next morning, another packet appeared, this one titled Emergency Vehicle Harmony Audit, Mandatory Participation Required. Inside was a form threatening a $150 non-participation fee. She also slipped a handwritten note under my doormat. Your resistance strengthens my resolve. Who writes villain monologues to their neighbors? Later that afternoon, a group of bewildered residents approached me. She fined me for washing my car too loudly, one said. She fined me because my headlights were too assertive. Another added, she fined me for insufficient wheel humility, said a third. Wheel humility. That was a new one. It hit me then that Karen wasn't just spiraling, she was dragging the whole neighborhood into her vortex. But the good news, every ridiculous fine, every fake regulation, every desperate power grab was more evidence. Evidence that would end her presidency, evidence that would end her crusade against my truck, evidence that would, ultimately, bring her face to face with real legal consequences. And by Friday's meeting, the neighborhood would no longer be under the rule of a clipboard tyrant. Karen didn't know it yet, but she was about to lose everything she'd built, and all because she believed she had the right to open my truck with a shiny brass key. I arrived at the HOA meeting 30 minutes early, not because I was eager to watch Karen implode, but because the board had specifically asked me to help set up the projector, seats, and, well, the security measures. Not physical security, emotional security. They knew Karen well enough to expect some kind of theatrical meltdown, and the last thing anyone wanted was her climbing onto a table again and shouting about vehicular insurrection. The community center was already humming with quiet tension. People whispered in small clusters, some clutching copies of the Mobility Harmony packet, like evidence in a courtroom, others holding their phones up with screenshots of fines Karen had sent at random hours. One guy had printed an 18x24 poster of the bogus wheel humility violation and taped it to the wall with the caption, "How is this real?" Even I had to stop and admire it. Jill approached me nervously, clipboard in hand, hair pulled back in the tight, stressed-out bun of someone who had hit her HOA limit. "She doesn't know what we're planning," she whispered. "She'll know in about 20 minutes, I replied. Jill nodded sharply. "Good. The board is united. That hasn't happened in 10 years. That's what happens when tyranny arrives in orthopedic sandals." She choked back a laugh. "Stay close when we begin. She's going to make this difficult." Oh, I knew. Karen didn't breathe without making something difficult. The residents filed in, some taking seats, others leaning against the walls like spectators at a boxing match. The room smelled faintly of coffee, anxiety, and mild resentment, all standard HOA aromas. Everyone was waiting for the show, and right on cue, the door slammed open. Karen swept in like a royal entering a coronation ceremony, navy blazer, fake earpiece, clipboard resting on her forearm like a sacred artifact, and a stack of her Mobility Council packets tucked under the other arm. The room groaned collectively. "There will be order," she announced. "It hasn't started," someone muttered. She ignored them. Instead, she marched to the front and planted herself beside the podium, glaring at the board as though daring them to challenge her. Jill stepped forward. "Thank you all for coming," Jill began. "Tonight's meeting will address—" "I'll be handling tonight's meeting," Karen interrupted, "given the heightened threat level to neighborhood vehicular harmony." "No," Jill said sharply. You could feel the room freeze. Karen blinked, taken aback. She wasn't used to that word. "No," she repeated. "That's correct," Jill said firmly. "The board will handle this meeting. You will sit down." Karen's jaw dropped so far it almost unhinged. "Sit down." "Yes," Jill said, "in the audience. Like everyone else." Karen's eyes snapped toward me, searching for backup, but I simply folded my arms and leaned against the wall. I wasn't here to save her. I was here to observe, document, and allow her to destroy her own argument. "I am the HOA president," Karen hissed. "For now," someone in the back whispered. Karen spun around. "Who said that?" No one answered. Jill cleared her throat. "Please take your seat." Karen didn't move, not at first, but her power was slipping. She could feel it. Finally, she huffed, the sound of a deflating balloon, and stomped into a metal chair in the front row. The meeting began. Jill introduced the agenda, thanked everyone for coming, and then moved on to the item everyone was waiting for. "Today," she said, "the board will address the concerning actions taken by our HOA president, including unauthorized fines, fraudulent documents, attempts to collect money under a non-existent organization, and repeated harassment of multiple residents." Murmurs rippled across the room. Karen shot to her feet. "Lees, all of it. I did what I had to do to protect the community from vehicular anarchy." "Sit," Jill said. Shockingly, Karen sat. Jill gestured toward me. That was my cue. I stepped to the front of the room with a simple folder, nothing flashy. I didn't need theatrics. I had evidence. "Good evening," I began, speaking calmly. "Most of you know me as your neighbor. Some of you recently learned I'm also the county sheriff. I've lived here for 3 years, and until recently, I never imagined needing to speak at an HOA meeting. But here we are." The room chuckled uneasily. "I want to walk you through the sequence of events that led the board to call this meeting." I laid the folder on the table and opened it, revealing printed photos and documents. First, the incident where Karen attempted to open my truck using a so-called master key. I held up a photo of her, caught in the act, brass key in hand. She then called 911 to report me as a suspicious individual refusing an HOA inspection. Gasps filled the room. "She did not know," I continued, "that she was calling the sheriff." A collective murmur swept across the audience. Even though many already knew the story, hearing it said aloud added weight. I flipped to the next page. Next, Karen issued unauthorized fines, dozens of them, many of which targeted other residents. I gestured toward the posters and papers people brought in. Charges for aggressive headlights, non-compliant wheel angles, emotional lawn imbalance caused by vehicle placement. These are not real violations. They do not exist in the bylaws. Heads nodded, people whispered angrily. Then there was the wheel clamp she placed on my truck. I placed a photo of the boot on the projector. Karen made a strangled noise but didn't interrupt. Not yet. She also called a tow truck and attempted to have my vehicle removed by claiming it was abandoned. It wasn't. I continued laying out each incident. The plywood barricade, the neon flags marking a non-existent HOA claim, the fraudulent Mobility Harmony Council, the payment demands, the QR code linking to her personal PayPal. She attempted to collect money through an unregistered organization, which constitutes attempted fraud. Karen finally erupted. I was acting in the interest of the community. Karen, I said gently, you immobilized a sheriff's truck with a clamp you bought online. That clamp was high quality, she shrieked. A man in the back burst out laughing. Jill held up her hand. Order, please. But the room wasn't laughing anymore. They were angry at being manipulated, fined, and dragged into chaos by someone who believed she owned their driveways. I finished my explanation, closing the folder. The evidence has been submitted to the county and the investigation is ongoing. However, the HOA board can take action tonight regarding her status. A board member stood and said, "We move to vote on the immediate removal of Karen Allen as HOA president." The room erupted in clapping. Karen jumped to her feet, eyes wild. "No, you can't do this. I am the only one holding this community together. Without me, you'll descend into parking mayhem." Jill didn't flinch. All those in favor. Hands shot up across the room, dozens of them. A tidal wave of fed-up residents. It was beautiful. All opposed? Jill asked. Karen shot her hand up. Alone, trembling with fury, Jill nodded. Motion carries. Karen Allen is removed as HOA president effective immediately. The collective exhale from the crowd felt like the first breeze after a long drought. Karen stood in stunned silence, like someone had unplugged her brain. Then she grabbed her clipboard, pointed at me, and shouted, "This isn't over. You can't escape Harmony. I will return stronger than ever." And with that, she stormed out of the building, slamming the door so hard the frame shook. The room sat in stunned silence for a moment. Then, applause filled the air. People clapped, cheered, laughed. Some even hugged. I just stood there, watching the door she'd stormed out of, knowing something the rest didn't. She wasn't done. Karen didn't retreat. Karen regrouped. And I had a sinking feeling her next move would make everything she'd done so far look tame. The evening after Karen's removal was the most peaceful the neighborhood had felt in months. People lingered outside their homes, chatting on sidewalks, watering plants, walking dogs without glancing over their shoulders for a charging pink blazer. Someone even joked that they could finally wash their car without violating vehicular emotional etiquette. Spirits were high. Relief was real. But peace, in my experience, is not the end of a story. It's the eye of a storm. Karen didn't show up the next day, nor the day after. Most people celebrated her absence, believing she'd finally slunk away in shame to lick her wounds and reorganize her army of imaginary committees. But I dealt with her long enough to know better. Karen didn't accept defeat. She repackaged it. It started quietly. A strange envelope showed up in my mailbox on Friday morning. Not HOA branded, not handwritten. It was printed professionally on linen paper, sealed with a gold circle sticker, as if it were an invitation to a royal gala. The return address was simply P.O. Box 214, Bluff County Oversight Initiative. I sighed before even opening it. Inside was a formal notice. Dear resident, due to recent concerns regarding vehicle compliance and driveway harmony, you are requested to attend a mandatory mediation session with the Bluff Community Oversight Initiative, BCOI. Failure to appear may result in further action. Signed at the bottom, in overly elegant script, Acting Coordinator, K. Allen. I let the paper fall onto the kitchen counter. She had reinvented herself again. A private entity, a fake oversight initiative. She wasn't running an HOA anymore. She was starting her own department of made-up government. This time, she'd even included a voluntary community contribution form with a suggested payment of $140 toward a driveway beautification project. And just like last time, the QR code pointed straight to a PayPal account under her name. She was escalating into fraud territory with confidence that would make a con artist blush. I grabbed my phone, snapped photos of every page, and filed them into my now bulging Karen Evidence, Volume 4 folder. Not 10 minutes later, my doorbell rang. It was my son. He wasn't in uniform, but he carried himself the same way he always did, alert, steady, patient. I waved him inside and handed him the letter. He skimmed the first paragraph, then shook his head. She's really trying to reinvent the HOA. Not reinvent, reincarnate. She sent the same letter to half a dozen residents, he said. Somebody dropped theirs off at the sheriff's office this morning. I poured him coffee. She's doubled down. She's not just doubling down, he replied. She's entering criminal territory. This isn't just harassment now, this is impersonation of authority and attempted collection of fraudulent fees. Can we charge her? I asked. Not yet, he said, but we can look into it. That was the balance we always had to strike. Professional distance, procedural caution. He handled things by the book, and I respected that. He set the letter down. Dad, she's unraveling. Be careful. I'm always careful, I said. He gave me a look. Okay, I'm usually careful. We shared a laugh, but concern hung in the air like humidity before a thunderstorm. The next strange event came that night. My motion sensor flicked on at 11:47 p.m. I checked the camera feed, expecting a raccoon. It wasn't. It was Karen. She wore a reflective vest, cargo pants, gloves, and carried what looked suspiciously like a tape measure, a clipboard, and a stud finder. She paced back and forth along the perimeter of my driveway like a surveyor on a very personal mission. At one point, she knelt and measured the angle of my truck's front tire. She scribbled furiously. Then she measured its distance from the lawn. Scribble, scribble. Then she held the stud finder against the fender like she expected it to reveal state secrets. I stepped outside onto the porch, arms crossed. Evening, Karen, I called. She gasped and dropped her tape measure. I was conducting an assessment, she stammered. At midnight. Timing is irrelevant when harmony is at stake. Karen, get off my property. I have authority under the Oversight Initiative. No, you have a vest you bought on Amazon. She bristled. A uniform, she corrected. A vest, a uniform, a vest, Karen. She stomped her foot like a toddler denied a cookie. You're obstructing justice. No, I said, stepping forward. I'm obstructing trespassing. I pointed at the camera. You're being recorded. She froze. That was her weakness. Not authority, not resistance documentation. She hated when her actions were captured by anything other than her imagination. She backed away slowly, muttering, "This will not stop harmony. This will not stop the initiative." Then she disappeared into the darkness of the cul-de-sac, reflective vest sparkling like a deranged firefly. The next morning, half the neighborhood found envelopes identical to mine. Some asked if I knew anything. Others asked if she could really find them again. No, I told them. She has zero authority, but she threatened legal action, one neighbor whispered. She threatens shadows, I replied. You'll be fine. Still, not everyone was reassured. Karen had spent years conditioning them to fear her clipboard. Undoing that takes time. By noon, I had collected 11 more letters from neighbors who didn't trust themselves not to burn them out of frustration. I forwarded everything to Deputy Hernandez. He called 20 minutes later. Yeah, I think we have enough for charges, he said. This initiative isn't registered with the state, not even close. She's fabricating documents and presenting them as legal authority. Do what you need to do, I replied. He hesitated. One problem, which is, she's probably expecting retaliation. She might have a meltdown before we can serve the papers. He was right. And the meltdown came that same afternoon. I was working in my garage when I heard shouting from the street. I walked out and saw Karen standing beside her Prius, waving a giant rolled-up poster like a battle flag. The community is at risk, she screamed. The sheriff's vehicle is a threat to harmony. People peeked out of curtains, some gathered. Everyone looked tired. Then she unrolled the poster. It was a blown-up satellite image of the neighborhood, with my truck circled dramatically in red marker, surrounded by arrows and labels like Unknown Vehicle Energy Zone, Potential Disruption Field, Driveway Dominance Risk. A kid down the street whispered, "Is he a superhero?" Karen spun on him. "No, he is a menace." At that moment, 2 sheriff's cruisers pulled into the street. Karen paled. Deputy Hernandez stepped out and approached calmly, professionally. "Karen Allen," he said, "we need to speak with you." She puffed up her chest. "Ah, finally, justice arrives." "Yes," he said, "it does." He handed her a packet of papers. She skimmed the first lines, then she screamed. It wasn't a normal scream. It was the sound of a woman whose imaginary empire had just collapsed under real-world law. "You can't do this," she shrieked. "I am the initiative." "No," Hernandez said. "You are being charged with harassment, falsifying documents, and attempting to operate an unlicensed entity. My initiative is legal. It doesn't exist. It exists spiritually. Spiritual HOA doesn't count?" She stomped, ranted, waved her arms, declared herself a guardian of peace, and accused me of leading a coup. I just stood there, arms crossed. When she finally ran out of breath, Hernandez spoke again. "Ma'am, you are formally ordered to cease all oversight activity. You are not to contact residents with demands, letters, or directives. Violate this, and further action will follow." Karen stared at me with fire in her eyes. "This is your doing," she hissed. "No," I replied. "This is your doing." She got into her Prius, slammed the door, and sped off. For the first time, she didn't yell out the window. She didn't even look back. That evening, the neighborhood felt different, lighter, calmer. Parents walked their kids. Teenagers skateboarded. Dogs barked without receiving noise citations. The shadow of Karen's clipboard tyranny faded like mist in sunlight. But peace never lasts long with someone like Karen, because I knew deep in my gut that she wasn't done forever, just done here. People like Karen never disappear. They relocate. Karen's departure should have felt like a victory. The neighborhood exhaled, relieved to finally live without threats of vehicular disharmony or shadow violations. Kids played basketball in driveways. People washed their cars at normal volumes. For the first time in months, the air didn't smell like clipboard ink and unreasonable fines. But I'd learned something long ago as a sheriff. Peace after chaos always feels fragile, like setting down a glass ball on the edge of a table. And with Karen, that feeling was twice as strong. Because she hadn't apologized, she hadn't admitted wrongdoing, she hadn't even muttered a symbolic promise to self-reflect. She left angry, humiliated, plotting. So while the neighborhood relaxed, I prepared. Not because I expected revenge. Karen wasn't the criminal mastermind type, but because she was the relentless type, the kind who would reinvent her authority, rename her organization, and come back preaching a new gospel of regulations no one asked for. Still, days passed quietly, then a week, then two. The sheriff's office processed her case, but she complied with the cease and desist order. Hernandez kept me updated. "She's keeping her distance," he said, "probably licking her wounds, or drawing new maps," I muttered. Then came the night that confirmed it. It was late, close to midnight. I was reading on the porch, enjoying the rare stillness. The moon cast long shadows across my yard, and the hum of crickets was the only sound. Then my trail cam pinged, motion detected. Back fence. I opened the feed, expecting deer or raccoons. It wasn't wildlife. A figure stood at the border of my property, just outside the legal line, not crossing it, not approaching, just standing there, motionless, staring toward the cabin. A woman, medium height, reflective vest. Even in the grainy night vision, I knew exactly who it was. Karen. She didn't move for nearly 10 minutes. Not a single step forward. Just stared, like she was mourning her lost territory, or measuring imaginary lines again in her head, or promising herself she'd rise like some HOA phoenix, reborn from laminated ashes. Then she turned and disappeared into the trees. She'd followed the order. She'd stayed off my land, but the message was clear. She hadn't let go. The next morning, I reviewed the footage carefully. She hadn't carried tools, documents, or one of her laminated monstrosities. She wasn't muttering legal jargon. She simply stood there like a ghost of bureaucracy past. A normal person might have been unnerved, but to me, it was confirmation of something I already understood. Karen's war wasn't against me. It wasn't against my truck. It wasn't even against non-compliant shadows. Her war was against irrelevance, and she was losing it. 2 weeks later, the final chapter arrived in a form I least expected. A package, delivered by courier, no return address, addressed to Sheriff's Dad, Cabin 12. Karen's sense of humor was as sharp as a marshmallow. I opened it carefully, half expecting glitter or homemade bylaws. Instead, pink tissue paper filled the box. Underneath it, A smaller silver box sat like a gift from a passive-aggressive fairy. Inside was a glitter bomb, a diffused one. She disabled the trigger, just glitter sitting harmlessly at the bottom, like a symbolic threat. There was a note taped to the lid. "This is what restraint looks like. You're lucky I'm taking the high road." I stared at it for a long moment. She wasn't threatening me, she was performing. One final act of petty rebellion to remind me she wasn't gone, just relocating. My son stopped by that evening. When I showed him the package, he shook his head. "She mailed you a disabled glitter bomb as a peace offering/threat. Symbolic artistry," I said. "Peak HOA creativity." He chuckled. "She's not coming back, Dad. At least not here." "I know," I said. "But she's not done," he sighed. "No, people like her never are." He wasn't wrong. Spring arrived, thawing the lake and softening the soil. The cabin felt alive again. I planted tomatoes and peppers, touched up the paint on the porch swing, and replaced the lights lining the path. Even the wildlife seemed calmer, less frantic, without Karen screaming about aggressive squirrels. The neighborhood returned to something like normal. Leonard, the new HOA president, sent me a handwritten letter thanking me for my patience during the Great Vehicle Crisis. His term, not mine, and included a jar of homemade jam. Peace felt possible again, and I was starting to believe, maybe foolishly, that the story had finally reached its end. That's when Tanya, who worked part-time at the county records office, stopped by with a folder in her hand and concern on her face. "You need to see this," she said. Inside the folder were documents, registered paperwork for a new HOA being established roughly 30 miles south in a brand new development. Incomplete, sloppy, missing signatures, but one section was filled out clearly. Proposed HOA president, Karen Allen. I closed the folder slowly. "She's starting over," Tanya said. "New neighborhood, new people to control. They don't know her history." I nodded. "They will. Are you going to warn them?" "No," I said quietly. "Some lessons can't be taught, only experienced." Tanya exhaled. "Well, at least she's not here anymore." "Exactly. And that was enough for me." Months passed. My son was promoted to chief deputy. The neighborhood regained its sanity, and every once in a while, when I sat on my porch sipping coffee, I'd think back to the chaos Karen brought into our lives. But it didn't make me angry anymore. It made me grateful, because you can't appreciate peace without surviving a few storms, even storms wearing pastel cardigans and wielding unauthorized master keys. One morning, a new couple walked down the trail with their dog. They paused at the fork where Karen once built her plywood barricade. They looked around, confused for a moment, then continued toward the lake. I waved, they waved back, and I realized something. Community doesn't require control. It doesn't require authority. It doesn't require fines, citations, or laminated threats. Sometimes all it takes is a wave, a path, a shared space, and the absence of someone screaming about vehicular silhouettes. Karen was gone. The cabin was mine again. The neighborhood was free, and somewhere, 30 miles south, a new HOA board was unknowingly about to learn that no matter where she goes, Karen will always bring her clipboard. If this whole saga taught me anything, it's that real authority doesn't come from titles, clipboards, or made-up regulations. It comes from responsibility, respect, and understanding the limits of your role. Karen built her world on control, imagined control, and when reality pushed back, she collapsed under the weight of her own inventions. There will always be people who try to impose their will on others, not because they're right, but because they're afraid of losing relevance. The best thing you can do is stand your ground, document the truth, and let their actions speak louder than your frustration. And now, I want to hear from you. What would you have done if someone tried to open your car with a master key? Drop your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more unbelievable HOA stories.